Well, first of all, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. So I want to make sure I have this right. So you were the first Indian immigrant, the first Asian American elected as a state rep in Kentucky, and I think that was 2018 you were elected, correct?
That's right, and sworn in 2019.
Was that a big deal for you to be those first, and what did it mean to you?
It was a big deal because honestly, we weren't not expecting necessarily to win. This was my first foray into elected office. I was running against a 20-plus year incumbent. And especially given the fact that there aren't a ton of immigrants in my district, certainly not a lot of South Asians in my district, we weren't entirely sure how this would go. So it was a huge sense of accomplishment for me and my family, but that's been reinforced even more since I was sworn in because a lot of other immigrants, not just South Asians, and a lot of younger immigrants have come up to me saying, look, I didn't realize this was possible. I'm so interested in this, and I want to be more engaged and more plugged in to our electoral politics in Kentucky.
Well, what do you think it was? Because it was stealth-like then. You were, I mean, you said like a long-term incumbent, but you won. Was it your message that resonated? I mean, have you gone back to think, okay, what was it? You must have done something obviously right.
Right. I mean, you're in office, I guess, for a long time. It's possible to be a little disengaged from your district and not be as visible or as out there. And I think that's exactly what the situation was, is that there was not a high level of engagement with our district and their representative. And that's what I found. So the sheer fact of me just knocking on doors, and this is something you'll hear on campaigns all the time, is you've got to knock on doors. People have to see you, they have to hear you, hear from you as the candidate in terms of what are you planning on doing for them when you're in Frankfort. And that's all I did. I was door knocking all
but
day.
Grassroots. But something
Yeah.
with your message resonated. And what do you think that was? Because you were
Yeah.
very much about working families and working hard and those kinds of things. Was there something in that message, do you think?
I think so. We have a lot of working families in my district. We have a lot of school teachers. We have folks that are trying to, live the American dream. And I think a lot of the policies, especially around the time that I was running for office, were not geared towards prioritizing them, supporting them, encouraging them, especially small business owners, our blue-collar workers, our educators. And I think that's something that was absolutely happening and that I was certainly willing to go to Frankfort to try to change, because that's the backbone of our economy, that's the backbone of our society. And I think that resonated because it's something that I said I would try to help. I didn't make promises that I would fix everything because that's not possible to do, but I would go and do my best to try to fight for them and be their voice in Frankfort. And I think that's what resonated with a lot of people.
And let's talk about hardworking families. You all moved from India here to Louisville when you were, 6 years old?
Yeah.
And what was the impetus for you all leaving India and coming here?
Yeah, it's an interesting story, and a lot of people always ask me why Louisville, Kentucky, right, from another country, why directly to Louisville, Kentucky, which at that time was not really a destination spot for a lot of immigrants, right? You had New York, you had California, some of these coastal cities. But inland, and especially in Kentucky, there wasn't a whole lot of international folks moving. But my parents decided to move to Louisville because of the DePaul School. So my brother had learning disabilities, and there wasn't a whole lot of opportunity in India for folks that had anything outside of the norm. So any kind of special treatment, special education, there just wasn't a lot of bandwidth. And that's true for anybody. So our family was doing well in India. My dad was an executive. So we didn't come here for economic reasons. In fact, they came over here and had to essentially start from scratch, so leaving a pretty good life behind.
Wow, so educational opportunities.
For educational opportunity for my brother. So he would have, as much of a chance as he could.
Then you ended up going through JCPS. Did I
did.
hear Atherton
Yes,
High
you
School?
did.
Okay, and then U of L, and
That's
then
right.
went on to law school, correct?
Well, actually, I went to Atherton. I went to U of L to get my degree in English literature, and then I went to law school. So I went to a very progressive law school. We had to do about 700 hours of clinical
Oh,
legal
wow.
work in the community.
And that was in D.C.?
That was in D.C. And then I moved back and got my MBA because I was starting my own practice.
So you are degreed up.
I'm degreed up. That's right. That's right. But a lot of it, was in anticipation of what I was doing at the time. So when I was in D.C., I wanted to get into policy work. So I interned for Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. I was interested in that kind of work. And then when I moved back, again, starting a law practice is essentially starting a small business. And so I figured I needed to have some basic groundwork on how to do that. Even though my dad had been a businessman his whole life, I figured I need to learn on my own.
I'm going to get back to your public service in just a minute, but what I wanted to do to segue into that, because you being the first Indian immigrant Asian American, when these Asian American hate crimes, we started to really see an increase in these numbers. What was your first thought? And I'm assuming it was how COVID was couched at the beginning, it was part of that. When you started first seeing this increase, what was your thought?
So my first thought was how important language is, that words matter, because the increase that we saw in anti-Asian violence or anti-Asian harassment across the country was a direct result of words like Kung Flu and calling COVID-19 the China virus. This is a direct line that you can see. It's around the same time. And it's a scapegoating that I'm very familiar with as an immigration law practitioner because it's something that's happened in this country since the beginning. So since the 1790s, people have been saying that immigrants are coming here to steal jobs, they bring diseases, or they're criminals. And so we saw the same exact rhetoric be employed time after time after time with different immigrant populations. And so the COVID-19 slurs were just the latest iteration against Asian Americans. And that also, just anti-Asian sentiment, has a long history going back to the Chinese laborers that built our railroads. And so I think that's something that I understood very, very keenly, the importance of language and how easy it is to drum up this type of feeling. It's not gone away. It's there just under the surface, and it just needs a little bit of encouragement.
So when
really
you
come
heard
out.
that language, then my guess is you weren't surprised
I was
when you
not
saw the
surprised.
correlation with
That's
those
right.
kinds of crimes going up.
That's right.
Have you personally experienced anything with everything that's been going on?
And that's an interesting question. I have not personally, because I think this particular strain of anti-Asian hatred was directed towards China, Chinese immigrants, anybody that looks like Chinese immigrants. And so I don't. I'm South Asian. And I think that's essentially why I have not borne the brunt of some of this Asian American harassment and anti-Asian sentiment that's been going on for this past year for COVID-related reasons. But that's the only thing that has stopped that from happening, right? So if it came from India, if the COVID-19 virus came from India or was said to come from India, then I would have. This would have been directed
You think you might have
towards
felt
me.
some of the brunt of
course,
that?
right.
Have you felt anything in Kentucky at all with being an Indian immigrant in any way, shape, or form after being elected or anything?
I think there's more of a curiosity. For some folks, I have not experienced anyone come out and be rude, be intentionally, harassing to me. I think that, we had an incidence of vandalism in Louisville back in 2019 with a Hindu temple. Certainly there have been instances with mosques, anti-Muslim sentiment. And so I think that over the years, this has happened, but not, for instance, with anybody that I know, any colleagues that know me, any friends, anybody in the community that knows me, because it's difficult once you know somebody to apply this sort of other label to them and treat them as less than human and treat them as somebody that's your enemy. And that's important.
I was going to say, so the key is dialogue, the narrative, the language we use. I know you were part of the gathering at Waterfront Park, to try to do that. So what is, I guess, the way that you bridge that divide? And it's just by talking, by meeting one another and feeling that sense of community that when it happens to one, it's to all?
Exactly. And you're seeing a lot of solidarity between, for instance, Black Lives Matter with the movement in Palestine and the injustices that we're seeing there. solidarity with our Asian American community. Because really, this idea of I'm discriminated against but you're not is no longer applicable, I think, to a lot of people. We're in this together, and the only way we're going to be able to combat this sort of hatred and violence is by standing against it together. But I do think, at least in my role and with my platform, I know that engaging in dialogue, in real dialogue, it's difficult at times. These are not easy conversations. But it's an educational dialogue, it's awareness building, it's just engaging people that wouldn't normally meet somebody like you and teaching them that you're human, your communities are human, you're both living the same life in America. Everybody is here as Americans. And I think that is something that is really important to communicate. And it makes it much, much more difficult later on for somebody to say, oh, well, that's just this group or that group, and dismiss everything about them and their entire experience. So that's something I work towards.
How do you start that difficult conversation with somebody? What would be your opening line, just out of curiosity? How do you do that? Because I think there are people out there is, how do I start this conversation? It can be uncomfortable at times.
Right.
So what would you say to begin that conversation?
So a lot of this stems from, and certainly since I was sworn in back in 2019, I didn't think immigration would be such a topic in Kentucky, right? In federal law and in the national narrative, immigration was a huge topic. Lots of changes were happening. There was a lot of demonization of immigrants who were deemed criminals, or the same rhetoric we were talking about earlier. But just having that opening, so there was a resolution that was praising Trump's border wall, for instance, and so I denounced it on the House floor. And that opened up a lot of different conversations, because people who had maybe voted for it or didn't think it was that big a deal were asking questions. Why does this bother you so much? Why is this something you felt you had to stand up and speak out against? And so it's an opportunity to teach people what does that mean? The wall is a symbol of something, right? And it means something different to you than it does to somebody like me, who sees it as really a negation of my presence in the United States. And that's been the trend. I'm hopeful that it's reversed now. But those conversations, so any opportunity you get like that, there was an anti-sanctuary city bill that was presented last year. Again, a lot of conversations with people that were supporting some aspects of it in terms of law enforcement or security. And that's kind of always the terminology that these things are couched in. But they have real impacts on how inclusive you are or how divisive you are within your own communities. And you had mentioned, how did I feel in Kentucky? Again, there's this myth of model minority, and a lot of folks in Kentucky had met their physicians who are maybe Indian or Pakistani. So there was this sort of favorable disposition to them that they may not have to Mexican immigrants, that they may not have to Chinese immigrants. Or any other, or immigrants from Africa. So, or they just may not know about them, right? So that's not fair, and it's certainly not how we should approach looking at somebody, seeing that they're different from you. It shouldn't take your position and authority, and again, just this personal interaction is what did it for them. So doing that on a bigger scale, I think, is the only way to try and overcome some of these prejudices, and creating space, so forums, town halls, podcasts, things like that.
And legislation.
And
I
legislation.
know that, federally,
Right.
just some making its way through.
Yes.
I assume you were pleased to see that.
Yes, I was very pleased to see a lot of changes happening to our immigration rhetoric, our immigration policy as well. And I'm hopeful that there will be some stronger, bolder moves made, because there was a lot of setback in the past few years in terms of, again, not just how immigrants feel, but literally their ability to come here. And that means families, that means employers who have sponsored these folks.
Now, you also started a business, so you're an immigration attorney, and public service. You also started a nonprofit. Tell me
Yes.
about that.
So back in 2013, I started a nonprofit. So I moved back to Louisville in 2010, started my law practice, and saw a real need for, again, engaging, building awareness, and informing the general public, informing other attorneys, and whoever was interested in the topic about what was going on. And the initial focus of the New Americans Initiative was citizenship. So taking populations, for instance, refugee populations that may be eligible for naturalization, which is a very expensive, very time-consuming, can be a fairly complex process depending on your circumstances. And so I wanted to make sure that if you're eligible for naturalization, that you get naturalized. Like if it's a financial obstacle, we could pool some funds together, give some grants. If it's something where English is a barrier, we could go through ESL, because there's a test for English, there's a test for civics,
Right.
which a lot of Americans can't pass. But it's interesting that that was the focus, and then it shifted very quickly to changes that were occurring because DACA had been implemented. And so what does that look like for thousands of people across Kentucky that may be eligible, the young people? Now they could work. Now they could get driver's licenses. So things that we tend to take for granted are hugely important for families that, if, let's say you can't drive, you can't go to get groceries,
Right.
you can't drop your kids
Huge
off
impediments.
at school, you can't work, you can't support your family, just minor things like that. And so informing people of changes that were occurring on that level as well. And then once the travel bans were put in place, there was the Muslim ban, there were a variety of different travel bans, and then everything during the previous administration that was sort of anti-immigrant, including the rhetoric. I did boot camps, several boot camps for attorneys that wanted to help, because a lot of my colleagues were saying, how can I help these people? How do I defend somebody in removal proceedings in immigration court? How do I track them down in detention? How do I help people with an asylum application? And so they became then geared towards attorneys, making sure they knew what the rights were for their clients, making sure that they could help or volunteer as needed in any other clinics. So
Was this always going to be your life's work, or was it because of the journey?
I think it was because of the journey. I knew early on that I didn't want to be an attorney just to be an attorney, so I wasn't interested in tax law, I wasn't interested in corporate law. I always knew that I wanted to be an attorney to help people, and so that policy piece of it was the important part. But as I mentioned, I had to do 700 plus hours of clinical legal work, and one of those clinics was an immigration law clinic. And so I was really able to see firsthand the direct impact you can have on someone's life for the good. So you can help these folks with whatever their immigration needs are, and it's tangible. You can see somebody become a citizen. You can see somebody become a permanent resident. You can see somebody escape a horrible situation and get asylum in the United States. And so I think that's really where my immigration law journey began, is in law school.
What would you say your life's lesson has been up to this point?
Well, that's a big question.
It is a big question, I know. But I just look, you came here when you were 6, and you're doing all of this public service work. I mean, is it to give back, and that's what you found? Or I don't know, is that something inherent that your parents taught you?
Yeah, and I think that's definitely where it started. So as I mentioned, my parents moved here. My dad gave up a pretty lucrative job. We had a nice life. He bought a grocery store. They didn't know anything about grocery stores. It was in Germantown, when there were still descendants of German immigrants living there. And so and then he built up several businesses from that point, essentially from zero. But he always tried to help people, even when we didn't have a whole lot. Tried to help anybody that needed help around him. And I saw that from an early age with him specifically. He would hire people that needed help. He would help financially, anything he could do. And my mother started a nonprofit called the Beaded Treasures Project, which started out helping refugee women.
I know that one.
Yeah. And so she started, essentially wanting to empower women. So not just teaching
It's in your
them,
blood.
It's there, right? I was never going to get away from it. And so this is it seems minor compared to what my parents have done, but it's how I can give back. And I think the importance of that, I've never seen anything different. And it's the most rewarding, fulfilling thing I think that someone can do, is take whatever your skills are, whatever your likes are, dislikes, and really channel them into giving something back to the community, no matter how small or how large that contribution is.
2 more questions. The American dream, what does that mean to you?
Fair opportunity. That's what it means to me. I think that people who come here, immigrants who come here, as we all did, come here because it's a fair shot. A lot of other countries, you don't get that. You're discriminated against because of your religion, because of your gender, because of where you are in the socioeconomic level. And in America, people came here and made their way. So there were no obstacles and no hindrances other than what you yourself contributed. This idea of pull yourself up by the bootstraps. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist for a lot of people. There is systemic racism. There are a lot of barriers for people who want to start businesses, who want to employ other people, who want to bring immigrants over to help. There's a lot of barriers for people just in terms of keeping a roof over their head, having clean water to drink, clean air to breathe, getting a fair education. And I think that, to me, is the most difficult part and the most difficult conversation about being an American is, have we given up on the American dream, which should mean that you come here and if you work hard and you contribute, you can accomplish whatever you want to accomplish. And I think that what's happened over the years has been that policy level changes have not reflected that ideal and have in fact worked against that ideal. And I think that as a legislator, as a congressperson, as a Metro Council person, it doesn't matter where you are. I think as a policymaker, that should be your goal, is furthering that American dream, making that American dream accessible to everybody in your community.
In light of everything that's happened, in light of this, increase in these awful crimes, do you still have hope in America?
I do. I always have hope in America. It's probably, I don't know what, it's not even cautious. I really do have a lot of hope and a lot of optimism because I see terrible things happen, but then I can see also hundreds of people gather at a vigil to stand in solidarity against those awful things that happened in Atlanta or in Kentucky or wherever it's happening. I think that we see a lot of evidence that not everybody is full of hate, not everybody is full of violence, and that there are people that will stand with you and support you. And I think creating space to see that, creating space to discuss that is the most important part of what I do as a legislator.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.